8 years ago, Saudi Arabia's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, announced his grand plan to kick what's described as Saudi Arabia's addiction to oil, known as Vision 2030. According to MBS, Vision 2030 would transform Saudi Arabia from a petro-state into a developed, diverse economy, with 50% of the kingdom's energy coming from renewable resources. Accordingly, in the past few years, MBS and his family have made some eye-catching investments in everything from football to futuristic cities in the middle of the desert. Somewhat unsurprisingly, these ventures haven't been entirely successful, pushing Saudi Arabia's national finances into an unexpected deficit and forcing MBS to abruptly scale back or scrap some of his more extravagant projects. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what's gone wrong with Vision 2030, and why, even if the kingdom is unlikely to run out of petrodollars anytime soon, MBS's missteps could create a political problem for the kingdom. So let's start with a bit of context. As one of the world's largest oil producers and its largest exporter, Saudi Arabia's economy is dominated by oil. In fact, the oil sector accounts for roughly 90% of export earnings, 80% of state budget revenues, and 40% of GDP. Although much of that remaining 60% of GDP is in some way dependent on the kingdom spending its oil revenue. 2 in 3 working Saudis, for instance, are employed by the state, and Saudi Arabian industry is massively subsidized by super cheap oil sold well below market price, and super cheap electricity generated by oil. For context, until 2016, electricity in Saudi Arabia cost 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to about 13 cents in the United States and 45 cents in Germany. And this is why non-oil industry accounts for 40% of all energy consumption, but only about 15% of GDP. And Saudi Arabia has the lowest GDP relative to energy consumption in the G20. Anyway, MBS is trying to reduce the kingdom's dependence on oil for both economic and political reasons. Politically, it's a problem because oil alone just can't provide enough jobs to keep a growing Saudi population employed, and creates a vast inequality between those in oil and non-oil sectors. Economically though, an over-reliance on oil won't be sustainable if oil demand declines in the coming decades. But it also leaves the economy at the mercy of oil price cycles, which have become increasingly volatile. Between 2007 and 2011, oil prices have doubled, halved, and then doubled again, making any rational economic planning essentially impossible, before the price plummeted yet again to unprecedented lows in 2014. Now, Saudi Arabia has been able to offset some of this volatility via OPEC, a Saudi-led cartel of oil-producing states that was expanded to OPEC Plus in 2016. However, a rise in non-OPEC production, including Canada, Brazil, and Guyana, but especially the United States with their shale boom, has both meant structurally lower prices and undermined OPEC Plus's ability to control the market. Recently, the Saudis have been trying to overcome this and force up prices with some drastic production cuts, but this hasn't gone down well with other OPEC Plus members. Many members have complained about production cuts or just refused to obey them, and in January, Angola actually quit OPEC, the third country to do so in just 5 years. Now, to diversify away from the instability of oil, the Saudis have invested in a range of headline-grabbing projects, including a new football league, buying up a whole load of video game studios, and building a futuristic line city in the country's northwest called Neom. Now, obviously, there have been some more mundane investments, but in the aggregate, the Saudis have apparently been remarkably unsuccessful. Average attendance at Saudi football games has declined to a measly 8,000 people, and transfer spending has been cut back. The video game studios had to be bought at an enormous premium to convince developers to move to Riyadh, and last month, the Saudis quietly admitted that they were focusing on just the first part of Neom's line city, and effectively cutting it from 105 miles to just 1.5 miles. They've even had to cut back investment in the oil sector. In January, Saudi Aramco announced that they'd abandoned their long-standing plan to increase their maximum sustainable productive capacity from 12 to 13 million barrels a day. Now, the scale of these investments and their failure to generate returns has suddenly put a strain on Saudi Arabia's public finances. Late last year, the Saudi Finance Ministry, which had previously anticipated successive budget surpluses until 2025, said that it now expects deficits until at least 2026. And a few weeks ago, it announced a $3.3 billion deficit in just the first quarter. its 6th successive quarterly deficit, and 4 times higher than a year ago. Annualized growth in the non-oil sector also fell from over 4% to 2.8%. And even this number is sort of flattering, because GDP includes any investment, even if, as is often the case in Saudi Arabia, it's not actually productive. Unsurprisingly, investors have become increasingly anxious, and foreign investment has dried up, forcing the Saudis to bridge their funding gap by borrowing unprecedented amounts and depleting their enormous foreign exchange reserves. Higher government spending and lower oil production means that Saudi Arabia's so-called break-even price has risen to $108 per barrel, according to Bloomberg Economics, making it the highest it's been since 2014, and higher than the vast majority of OPEC members. Now, it's important not to overstate all of this. The kingdom still has enormous cash reserves, and its debt-to-GDP ratio is just 26%, well below most equivalent economies. It's also worth saying that some of this economic pain is self-induced. The Saudis are voluntarily cutting production in order to boost prices, but they could easily increase their overall revenue by just maximizing production, because the increased volume would comfortably offset any decline in global prices. Nonetheless, this should still worry MBS for 2 reasons. Firstly, even if there's no immediate risk to the Saudi economy, unless he sorts this out, the Saudi economy will be under some real strain when global oil demand does eventually peak. Secondly, these diversification efforts have been accompanied by rapid social reforms. While they're still not equal citizens, millions of Saudi women have been granted newfound rights to drive, work, and travel. Cinemas, art shows, rock concerts, theme parks, and even raves are popping up across the country, and the austere Wahhabist Islam, historically promoted by the Saudi ulama, is being replaced by a more tolerant, inclusive version. This is most evident in the sharp change in tone from the Saudi-led Muslim World League, an organization that was previously associated with the more extremist Muslim Brotherhood, but last year ratified a new charter that opens with the words, "All people, regardless of their different ethnicities, races, and nationalities, are equal under God." Anyway, while MBS has successfully suppressed conservative opposition to these reforms so far, if the economy doesn't perform and his popularity wanes, a potentially destabilizing conflict with the ulama will become increasingly likely.